He said later in his life that it was like a match hitting straw in his brain. His brain just exploded in flames and ideas of what the world could be and what mysteries were out there and what adventures there could be.
Welcome to Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute, hosted by Georgina Downer. The name Flinders comes up almost as much as Menzies when it comes to landmarks, institutions and buildings. Just think of Flinders Street here in Melbourne, Flinders Street Station, of course. Then there's Flinders Island, Flinders University in Adelaide, and the Flinders Ranges, Flinders Chase National Park, to name but a few, and there are a lot more. I believe he even has more statues in Australia than any other person. But who is the Flinders behind the name? Well, we're very lucky today to have award-winning journalist and author Grantlee Kieza to join us to talk about Matthew Flinders. Grantlee has written a biography of Matthew Flinders, aptly titled Flinders, and we will have, I suspect, a rollicking good discussion on this incredibly important figure in Australian history. So welcome, Grantlee.
Oh, thank you very much for having me, Georgina. Yeah, it's great to talk about Flinders. It's amazing that not only did he prove Australia was an island continent and circumnavigate Van Diemen's Land, but he actually gave Australia its name. And I still think the vast majority of Australians wouldn't know that. So hopefully my book and this podcast will help redress that to some extent, because he was a great man, a very adventurous man, a very determined and extremely brave man who also did so many great things for expanding the knowledge of the world to the rest of the planet.
Yeah, no, he is someone of enormous significance, and I guess rightly so. So many things have been named after him in Australia. But naming things after someone doesn't necessarily mean that we know who they are, does it? I mean, it's interesting. You sort of look at Flinders Street Station, I pass it every day here in Melbourne. But do we reflect on Flinders, the name? Do we reflect on the name Melbourne? Do we, reflect on the name Brisbane, where you are based? The name is important as a commemorative function, but it's the telling of the story and reminding people why that name was chosen, who that person was and what their contribution to the place and the country is. Grantlee, you have given a very quick taste of who he was, circumnavigating Australia and mapping Australia and giving Australia the name. But can you paint a picture of who Matthew Flinders started out on? Like, where was he born, his childhood, what type of person did he become?
Yeah, well, he was born in a village called Donington in Lincolnshire in England. And Lincolnshire is a unique part, I guess, of the British landscape. It's very much marshland and what they call fens. A lot of the land is marshes are drained to make pasture. So Flinders grew up in an area that was half earth and half sea. And from a young age, he was intrigued by the flow of water. And as a little boy, he would go and look at creeks to see where they came from and where they headed to. And his father was a country doctor, what was called a surgeon and man midwife. And his speciality was delivering babies, which in the late 1700s was a pretty precarious job, not just for this man midwife doing it, but of course for the mothers having babies, because the infant mortality rate was extremely high. It could be a very disturbing job for Flinders Senior. He would go out to people's houses, often very late at night, have to make a mad dash out there to some poor farmer's little abode, little cottage, and sometimes the mother and child would die. And it was very traumatic for him. He'd come home lathered in sweat and very distressed. And Matthew Flinders Jr., the great explorer, would see that. And Matthew Senior, the doctor, wanted Matthew Jr. to follow him into the medical profession, but Matthew had seen enough of this sort of trauma that he didn't really want to pursue this. And as a young boy, his father would sometimes take him to the town of Boston in Lincolnshire, which is a small port, and Matthew would be intrigued by all these boats bobbing around, and he'd see their sails unfurling and heading out to sea. And as a young boy, his father had a very small library. I was very fortunate in writing this book because I had access to all of Matthew Senior's diaries, and he kept meticulous records about his family, his children, their birthdays, what they were doing. As I guess we would use Facebook today, documenting all our little things. He did that with his family. Even the trauma of losing children. They weren't a wealthy family, and his wife had 10 children. Matthew Senior's wife had 10 children, and some of them would perish in infancy. And Matthew, sounds cruel these days, Matthew Senior wasn't all that perturbed by that, because he even wrote at one time, we're very hard up for cash. At least that's a couple of mouths I no longer have to feed.
Wow, very practical about it.
Very, very tough times. Yeah. But the children that were living, he doted on them, and he took young Matthew often on his travels with him to visit relatives. And he also accumulated a very small little library, and one of the books was Robinson Crusoe. And Matthew, from a young age, he went to a little school in Lincolnshire, a little private tutorship, a home school, and he learned to read at a very young age. And he was fascinated by the story of Robinson Crusoe. He said later in his life that it was like a match hitting straw in his brain. His brain just exploded in flames and ideas of what the world could be and what mysteries were out there and what adventures there could be. Even though, Robinson Crusoe ends up on a desert island, Matthew Jr. was fascinated. The young mind was fascinated by exploring all these distant places. And from a young age, from his young teens, he became a junior member of the Navy and started travelling around the world. It wasn't always that much fun. He was involved in really ferocious battles with the French. His great mentor had his leg blown off in front of him. So, it was pretty tough times. And Matthew Flinders was exposed to very horrific things at a young age. But he also managed to join voyages of exploration. And one of the first ones he was on was a very early voyage of Captain William Bligh, who was an irascible sort of a character. Matthew didn't get on with him all that well, but he certainly did respect Bligh's seamanship and his abilities as a great mariner. And Matthew travelled around the world with him. First coming to, I guess, Bruny Island. There's his first taste of what is now called Australia was the voyage that they touched at Bruny Island and then on their way to Jamaica.
Oh, fantastic. Well, I've been to Bruny Island and it's certainly pretty rough around there, so he would have got a taste.
Some of the boats these guys were in, Matthew with George Bass, his great friend George Bass and Flinders, they later on circumnavigated Van Diemen's Land, which is now called Tasmania, in a very small little schooner, not much longer than a car, really, the size of it. And I just went on a cruise on a huge ocean liner through Bass Strait, and it was a bit rough in that. So you could
it's notoriously rough.
And the whole time, people today don't realise, they say, I drew maps. Like, it wasn't like using GPS. Matthew Flinders would be standing on a box, because he was only a small guy, standing on a box with a sextant and a telescope, making drawings as he was going with the ship rocking around. And his maps of Van Diemen's Land and later the continent of Australia are very, very close to what we have now, even with computers and GPS navigation.
Yeah, it's truly amazing, isn't it? Just back to his early years in Lincolnshire, was it normal for a young man to deviate from his father's career like that? He didn't obviously have a naval background in the family, the expectation he would be a surgeon, take over his father's work. Was that strange to go to the Navy?
It wasn't unheard of. Matthew had an older cousin who was in the Navy, and he sort of smoothed the way for Matthew to join. But it's interesting, as I was saying, Lincolnshire is a unique landscape. It's half water and half land. Even the marshy land is hard to differentiate sometimes where the water comes in. And it's interesting that three of the great navigators and mariners of that time came from there. There was Flinders' friend George Bass, who he didn't know in his childhood, but lived not far away in Lincolnshire, and also John Flinders, who became the governor of Van Diemen's Land. He was also Matthew's cousin.
Yes, right, I see. So there was at least some sort of connection to that.
I should say John Franklin, not John Flinders. Franklin.
As you say, he joins the voyage captained by William Bligh to Tahiti. And it's interesting in his career, he's always sort of coming up against the French. The French are a real problem for him. I mean, typical of the English, and they're battling the French really until very recently, really.
Yeah, that's right. There was wars between them on and off for a couple of 100 years, and it always affected what was happening. But they were fortunate in some regard. Matthew, in his voyages of discovery, he was fortunate in some regard because England and France had almost a mutual agreement for a long time over scientific expeditions. So even though French and English ships would meet as they did off South Australia, they didn't actually fire cannons at each other. They were actually on fairly cordial terms, wary of each other, but cordial in the extent that they felt that they were both doing something to advance the knowledge of the human race.
He fights in just one battle against the French in 1794, but how does this part of his career lead to the sort of cartography that he becomes world renowned for?
Yeah. Well, one of the things I really loved in learning about Matthew and writing his story was the fact that at one stage, he'd been involved in this, what they call the glorious battle in June against the French, and he'd seen several ships sunk, and he'd seen his mentor have his leg blown off, and he'd seen people dying all around him. But one of the things he said not long after that was he was in the Navy, but he realised that the only way he could rise in rank through the Navy was to win battles and kill people. And he said that was totally against his nature. He saw himself as a scholar and a scientist, and he wanted to improve humankind rather than destroy it. And I really felt an affinity with him in that. He was a guy who really wanted to help mankind know what was out there beyond the horizon and find places that people in the Northern Hemisphere did not even know existed. And that's what he set his life's course on.
Grantlee, what sort of training would he have had to do that level of cartography? Because it's, I mean, as you say, he was standing on a box on these sort of ships and the rough seas and, you know, with this sextant, and the maps he creates incredibly accurate. I mean, still used to this day. It's just an extraordinary achievement. But he didn't have a university education, did he? So, and he's come from
a rudimentary scholastic education. I mean, not even a long time at what we'd call a high school. From his young teens, he was in the Navy, and so he basically learned on the job. He would watch the other midshipmen, and he learned a lot from Bligh. He learned a lot of seamanship from Bligh. He also studied books on celestial navigation. I can never get over the intrepid nature of people like Matthew Flinders, especially Matthew, because I think he was a guy who was devoted to the cause of mankind. In many ways, he saw James Cook as his great exemplar, and Cook, of course, was a great navigator and cartographer. And so Matthew would study books on celestial navigation, and you know, it's amazing. Until only about 50 or maybe even 40 years ago, even Qantas pilots would navigate by the stars before computers and GPS. You would take off in an aircraft and there'd be a guy with a table with a chart looking at the stars in the skies to see where they were, what position they were over the ocean. And Matthew was doing that back in the late 1700s and early 1800s, navigating around the world by the stars, you know, sometimes hoping for the best. And it's extraordinary that even with that rudimentary education, he was able to navigate the world.
He becomes a sort of, I guess, a mentee of Joseph Banks, doesn't he?
Yeah.
And I mean, how does that relationship develop?
Well, Banks was one of the richest young men in Britain when he sailed with James Cook. He more or less funded the voyage of the Endeavour, the great voyage of the Endeavour, which charted the east coast of Australia and New Zealand and lots of places in between there in England. But Banks had inherited a vast fortune, and part of his fortune was located in Lincolnshire. He had a mansion and a huge estate in Lincolnshire, and he was the great employer. He employed hundreds of, if not thousands of people as tenant farmers and workers on his estates. And he would have a big fair there every year in Lincolnshire. It was like the huge, I suppose it was like the huge country fair that you would have in Australia somewhere, like a regional show. And that was a huge event for everyone in Lincolnshire. So from a young age, Matthew Flinders was very well aware of who Joseph Banks was. And from a young age, he had also been intrigued by the voyage of the Endeavour between 1768 and 1771. And when Matthew was quite young, the book about that voyage, there were several books written about the voyage, but it became a real bestseller in Britain, as much as books could sell at that time. And so Matthew was very well aware of it and was intrigued by that voyage. So he was a fan of Joseph Banks virtually from the time he was born. And as he advanced in the Navy, he became much more associated with Banks. Banks was the president of the Royal Society for almost half a century, which more or less made him the chief scientist in Britain. And any voyage of exploration, even later voyages by Cook and other explorers, people like Vancouver, they all needed the stamp of approval from Joseph Banks, even the voyages of William Bligh on the Bounty.
Through this position of the Royal Society. Yeah.
And also connections with the British government. I mean, he was the de facto minister. He was more or less the de facto boss of the early colony of Australia. All the governors reported to Joseph Banks rather than the British government first. So from a young age, Matthew Flinders knew that if he was to get anywhere as an explorer, he would have to deal with Joseph Banks. And on one of his voyages, he delivered messages when he returned for Joseph Banks for other officers on the voyage. So he became acquainted with Joseph Banks. And after a couple of years in Australia, when he first came out to Australia and was based in Sydney, Matthew Flinders returned to Britain, and he said that the great mystery of New Holland was whether it was an island, a huge island, whether it was a series of islands. No one really knew. They knew what the East Coast was like, and they'd sailed along the coast of what's now South Australia. But no one had been much further up north and gone around to the what's now West Australia or the Northern Territory. So he went to Banks with a proposal and said, Sir Joseph, the great mystery still in the world is whether this huge land, we've got colonies there, we've got a colony in Sydney and we've got a colony forming in other areas of New Holland. The great mystery is whether it's true nature. And I want to mount a voyage. If you can back me, I want to mount a voyage. I'll put my life on the line and I want to see if we can sail around the whole thing to prove once and for all what's down there. And Banks more or less said, yep, straight away, great idea. I'll get on to my friends in the government. And very, very quickly, they found a surplus warship that was too rickety for war purposes. It was falling apart.
But fine for circumnavigating Australia. Yeah.
Call the investigator. Okay, I'll get you a team. I'll get you some sailors, about 100 or so sailors and some Marines and whatever to make sure there's no mutinies. And away we go.
So was the funding for the trip from Banks himself, or was it from the British government, or a combination?
Well, it was a combination. I mean, Banks provided a lot of supplies and he would provide things like plants and whatever to take out because he saw Australia as eventually being a great agricultural powerhouse. So he would send stuff out. But it was primarily the British government and the Admiralty. And Flinders was given specific instructions how long he was to take and, how much he could spend and what the aims were. Yeah.
How precarious were these types of expeditions? I mean, Matthew Flinders obviously had an immense well of personal bravery. I mean, some of the things he, I think you write about, he was shipwrecked on the Great Barrier Reef and he rowed a cutter, which I'm not a maritime person, a tiny boat. Yes, I'm assuming, all the way to Sydney to save his crew's lives. I mean,
that's right.
From the Great Barrier Reef to Sydney in a tiny boat. He was a brave man. So this type of expedition, do you have a sense of whether it was a sort of a 1 in 10 chance that you would perish, or 1 in 50 or 1 in 2? Was it?
Well, the ship he sailed on, the Investigator, was literally falling apart. It was a very, very dodgy vessel. And Matthew got in trouble with the Admiralty as well because he wanted to take his new wife with him and try to smuggle her on board. And so he was offside with them for a start. It was more or less get going now or we're going to pull you off the ship. So he was in dangerous waters right from the start of the voyage. And the ship, the Investigator, gave them a lot of trouble at different points of the journey and in the end was deemed unseaworthy to sail back to England. It was repaired after a long time, but Matthew had to find other ways to get back to England, see his wife after the circumnavigation of Australia, which of course led to all his trouble when he...
Yes. Well, before we get on to that, and we must hear about the actual circumnavigation, you've talked about the wife a little bit. Tell us about his beloved Anne.
Well, Anne Flinders, they'd known each other for... She was his, I guess, a pen pal. She'd come from a fairly traumatic background too. Her father had been a merchant Navy officer. There was no workers' compensation in those days, and her father had died of a fever in what's now Indonesia. So Anne and her mother were left pretty much in destitute circumstances, and she resolved that she would never marry a sailing man, never marry a Navy man, because it had been so traumatic. She knew the perils of going to sea and the terrible circumstances that they were left in. But he was persistent. She was quite a fashionable person of her day, almost like a Jane Eyre sort of character, I guess, as young women were at the time, quite well educated, well learned and well versed. He could have great conversations with her and they were soulmates. But he was always caught in, I guess, the dilemma between going on his voyages, which was his great passion, and his feelings for his new wife. And he hoped to be able to combine the two, and even though it was precarious, take her on the voyage with him to Australia, but it didn't happen, and he had to leave her behind and set off. And instead of his wife, he befriended his little cat, Trim.
Yes.
And that became his soulmate. But he wrote to his wife at one stage saying how lonely he felt. He just had the cat and, no one else to really pour his feelings out to.
He had sort of, I mean, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but it seemed like he had sort of three great loves of his life. Obviously, Anne, his friend George, Bass, and the cat, Trim. They sort of were three really, really important beings. No, obviously not a person in the cat.
That's right. And I'd say his overriding passion was his sense of adventure and his great desire. He was extremely ambitious, very, very pushy guy, young guy, and a great belief in himself. And he wrote to Banks at one time to say that he wanted to be famous. He wanted to be known throughout the world as this great explorer who discovered lands and peoples that no one knew about. And he said, well, no one's, it's a bit like a writer saying, well, Hemingway once said Shakespeare's number 2, and then there's anonymous, I want to be number 3. Well, Flinders more or less said, well, I'll never top Cook, but I want to be number 2. And that was ambition. It was an ambition that created a great deal of fame for him at the time, but also caused him a great deal of distress as well.
Yeah. But I guess that came with being an explorer, didn't it? Tell me about his journey around Australia then, Grantlee.
Yeah, well, he set off from Britain in pouring rain and didn't bode well for the journey. Had to leave his wife behind. He was quite heartbroken. They made it out to the coast of Western Australia around Cape Leeuwin. He knew where that was because voyages previously had passed there, and that had been a point seen by the Dutch even more than 100 years before. And then he sailed along the coast of the south of Western Australia and made it into the waters of what we would now call South Australia. And, of course, he had a lot of problems along there. He lost some of his crew, some of his beloved crew. He encountered great calamity. It's amazing that on a ship with a crew of about 100 people, a lot of them couldn't swim. And you think, how could that possibly be? But that was the state of things in the day. A lot of people, until modern times, couldn't swim. And even sailors traversing the world couldn't swim.
Yeah, seems extraordinary.
A little boat went out with 8 of his crew on it, and they were watching it from a distance. And the water wasn't especially rough, but the next time they looked out, the thing had capsized and the sailors were nowhere to be seen, and quite horrific for Matthew Flinders and the rest of the team. But he named 8 different islands there after them. But sadly, that was the first great blow of the voyage, and things would become even more traumatic at different times.
Why did he choose to go south when he hit Cape Leeuwin and not north, especially as the north hadn't been, that was where the sort of mystery, I guess, was?
Yeah, well, his first aim was to get to Sydney. I mean, that was going to be the base. That's where the colony was. That's where the governor of New South Wales was. So on his orders, that was his first mission, his first point of call. The settlement in Van Diemen's Land really hadn't started yet. There were whalers and sealers operating out of there, but the British colony in Van Diemen's Land hadn't really started. So that was his base, and where he would refit the ship because it needed a lot of repairs after the voyage. It was in a bad state when they left, and it was in a worse state when they arrived. And he assembled his team. He got together with his Indigenous pal Bungaree, who'd helped him on previous voyages in New South Wales and going up the coast of what's now Queensland and explorations there. And so they then set off on a year and a half journey around Australia.
And so this journey started, as you said, in Sydney and then went north up the coast of Queensland with Bungaree, Ku-ring-gai man. And Bungaree was sort of able to act as a peacemaker and interpreter for all the First Nations people that Matthew encountered.
Flinders he formed a real friendship with Bungaree. I mean, as we know, a lot of the colonial explorers and Navy officers and Army officers weren't always that kind to the Indigenous people, but Bungaree, Flinders called him a brave and worthy fellow, and they were pals. And Flinders, years later, would write with great affection about Bungaree. But Bungaree's role was, I guess, to act as a peacemaker and an envoy, even with people. And don't forget, he really didn't understand the languages of a lot of the people he came across, and they would wonder, who's this guy? Who's this character? And it's funny, Flinders had a great sense of humour too, and he said at one time, some of the Marines with him put on a marching show for some of the Indigenous people that they met, and the Indigenous people were very impressed, and they started marching, thinking it was some sort of a dance and marching along.
Fair enough.
Them. And then they would have a sing-along. The Indigenous people would sing one of their songs, and Flinders said Bungaree and sang a song for them, and they were all very unimpressed and turned away from him. And Flinders just had a little aside saying, even amongst his own people, he's not regarded as a good singer. So he had a very good sense of humour.
Yeah.
But Bungaree acted as an envoy and tried to sort of placate hostile Indigenous people whenever they would encounter them. Not always successfully, but the voyage pretty much went without too many bad incidents. There were a couple of obviously skirmishes and things, but it was a voyage of discovery rather than a voyage of conquest.
Yes, they would have to go to shore every now and again, no doubt, to get water and supplies and things like that. And that obviously was when they were going to have the interactions with the Indigenous people. Yeah. There's a story you might elaborate on about a potential skirmish that was diffused through the facilitation of some haircuts.
That was early in the piece. That was that was before the circumnavigation. That was on an earlier voyage with George Bass. As I say, Flinders had a lovely sense of humour. They were just south of Sydney, and I guess what's called the Illawarra region. And Flinders came ashore, and they were met with a number of warriors with spears surrounding them. And Flinders was very nervous, and they were very wary of him too. They'd obviously, as Flinders wrote, they'd obviously seen the power of muskets at some time, and so they were wary of each other, but Flinders decided to try and make friends, and he showed them a pair of scissors and how they could cut. And so he tried to explain to them that this was used to cut hair and beards, and some of the warriors sat down to have a haircut and a beard trim. And Flinders was showing them how they trimmed the beards, and everyone was looking on with their spears, quite fascinated. And Flinders said just for a moment he thought of giving the guy sitting down a little nick on the nose with the scissors just for a joke, and he thought the situation was perhaps not
too tense to have too many
to avail that sort of a guy. Yeah. Yeah.
What were the highlights then, do you think, of the circumnavigation around Australia? I mean, it's incredible to think he was seeing things, at least from a British perspective, for the first time ever. And even I know the Menzies government starts the bauxite mining at Weipa in Queensland, and you can see in some of the illustrations of the time that Matthew Flinders was circumnavigating, the bauxite is there in those cliffs. So, they were really detailed and observing things that we might then not reflect on for another 150 years, but actually we did have the records that Matthew Flinders had created in 1801.
Yeah, it's amazing. He was under pretty strict time constraints, and it's interesting, even in the circumnavigation, he missed a lot of things because he wasn't searching, he wasn't making detailed search. He wanted to prove that Australia was an island, or to find out if it was an island. So he missed, for instance, the mouth of the Murray River and things, because it was a long way offshore. He wasn't always getting in close, and he missed some of the big rivers in what's now northern New South Wales. But he gave the outline. He achieved his purpose of proving that Australia wasn't connected to Asia, that it was a separate island. So that was the main purpose and the thing that he achieved. But other things that I found fascinating was, up in off Northern Territory and the Gulf of Carpentaria, he found Malaysian ships, I guess you would say modern-day Malaysia, and Chinese vessels. And he found evidence that the Chinese and people of, I guess, Indonesia had been in those waters hundreds of years before, and they knew those waters very, very well. And so that was, I think, really fascinating. But he was the first one to prove that the whole thing was connected, was one giant landmass and not a series of islands.
Yes, and that type of knowledge was fundamental for the development of Australia, the colony of Australia.
Yeah, and he also, by having circumnavigated Van Diemen's Land, as far as shipping was concerned, he saved weeks of British vessels coming to Australia, because they previously would go to the south of Van Diemen's Land and come up. And by exploring what he called Bass Strait after his friend George Bass, he would allow them to take weeks off the voyage because they could go through Bass Strait rather than the south of Tasmania. So as far as that was concerned, he advanced the shipping and the trade between Australia and England a great deal.
Yeah.
He also, the most important thing was that he increased the knowledge of what was down here in this part of the Southern Hemisphere to the rest of the world.
Yeah. But what about that rivalry with Nicolas Baudin, the French explorer? I mean, as a South Australian girl, of course, that's of great interest to me.
It's amazing, isn't it? Flinders had been in wars with the French, and they're sailing along, and they see what looked like pyramids in the distance, 2 pyramids in the distance coming to them. And as they got closer, found out that they were French ships with their sails up. And so there was a real tense standoff there. And Flinders probably exaggerated the meeting. He put a British perspective on it, that these dopey French, they didn't even know about scurvy and their crew were all dying and whatever. But it's fascinating. They exchanged ideas, and Flinders went aboard Baudin's vessel and they chatted and shared notes and whatever. But it's extraordinary that Flinders didn't realise at the time that the French were naming points all along the south of Australia, and in Victoria, after the French, they were calling it Terra Napoleon. And one of the officers on Baudin's ship was drawing up plans for the French to attack the colony of New South Wales, attack the port at Sydney, because he felt it wasn't very heavily defended. And if they sent out a big fleet of ships, they could easily take it and, declare it as French territory, which was very much a plan, except that the French at the time were involved in a very, very grim battle with the English, the Napoleonic Wars, and it was a war they ended up losing. But if they'd won, Australia
might
could
have been called Napoleon land.
That's right. Terra Napoleon. Yeah.
Terra Napoleon. Yes. So the name Australia, of course, comes from ancient times, but it is something that we can have Matthew Flinders to thank for. Can you explain that?
Yes, well, as Flinders was sailing along in the Investigator from England towards Sydney, he was passing along the bottom of Western Australia and South Australia, and he would see different Indigenous people. And he later wrote in his journal that he called them, these Australians came out to see us. He used that word, these Australians, because the word Austral, of course, had been used for the southern lands for some time, and he called them the Australians. And when he went back to England with his maps of what he navigated, his original map that he submitted to Joseph Banks to send on to the Admiralty had written at the top of it, Australia or Terra Australis. He wrote that on the map, but Banks and the Admiralty preferred the name Terra Australis for the land. But it was Flinders' idea to call it Australia right from the start. And eventually, with the publication of Flinders' book, one of the fans of that book was Lachlan Macquarie. And from the early time that Macquarie was governor of New South Wales in about 1810 until he left in about 1821, Macquarie was always using the word Australia when he sent back. And in his farewell speech to the colony of Sydney when they came out to farewell him before he left for England after a decade as governor, he started the speech by saying, fellow Australians. And so that word Australia then just cottoned on. It just became part of the lexicon for
So from that period of 1820s, we start to use the term Australia. And I mean, I know in Matthew Flinders' book, A Voyage to Terra Australis, which we'll talk about in a few moments, he says in his introduction that, okay, he uses Terra Australis, but he thinks that Australia was probably more agreeable to the ear as a name.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, more efficient.
That's right, yeah.
Forget the terror. Now,
it's amazing. And most people who live in this country, 27 million, would not know that that's where the name comes from.
They really would not. Now, Matthew Flinders, even if you don't know much about his story, if you've been to Sydney, you might have seen the statue of him and his lovely little cat, Trim.
Yeah.
So tell us about Trim, Grantlee.
Well, Flinders, I think, at heart was a very kind man. As I said before, he stated that his mission wasn't to destroy human beings, but to improve their knowledge. So he wanted to help mankind. And I think he was a very kind man. He got this rescue cat that he'd seen fall into the ocean and climbed up on a rope back to safety. And he was just so besotted with its courage and its spunk, I suppose.
It was like a super cat. I mean, it's just amazing. I guess brave and spirited like its owner.
Yeah, very much. They were kindred spirits. And like Matthew Flinders, Trim was very sure of himself and very confident and quite bossy at times and chasing other cats away and even standing up to some of the dogs that they would encounter. So Flinders was besotted with it and it travelled with him everywhere, even on the smallest voyages. Trim would go with him. Even Bungaree sort of was in love with Trim as well. They just loved this black and white cat. But sadly, Flinders was sailing home on another rickety vessel back to England to see his wife after circumnavigating Australia. They got detained at Mauritius and Trim was eaten by one of the slaves there, one of the starving slaves. And Flinders was at the time extremely dejected. He was imprisoned by the French on Mauritius accused of being a spy. And so he was extremely dejected and even suicidal at times. And the loss of Trim, just really, really hammered him. And eventually he recovered, though, and he wrote a small book in tribute to his cat. He wrote it in French to practice his French because he was dealing with these French jailers. But he was so besotted, and that book is still around. You can still get the book on Trim.
Sweet.
It was amazing. You can call it a love story between man and an animal. But Trim was his friend in the loneliest and hardest of times and in desperate storms on the ocean and in the horrors of the jails that he spent time in on Mauritius.
And there's a lovely story behind the name Trim, isn't there, Grantlee?
Yeah, well, it was a character in a book that Flinders loved, Tristram Shandy, yeah. Lovely story, yeah.
And Trim was the chef the butler and wore black and white,
yeah.
Trim the cat was a black and white cat, so therefore...
That's right, yeah. Yeah. And he was just intrigued by its personality,
Yeah. He, as you said, spends quite some time in Mauritius, which delays his return to his beloved wife, Anne. It's pretty sad, isn't it? I mean, their marriage, I think, is for about 13 years or so, but they barely spend, even a year together.
Oh, that's right, yeah. Once again, Matthew was pugnacious and kind of arrogant, pushy kind of guy, and if he'd been a little bit more mellow, maybe the French captors would have let him go. But when he arrived in Mauritius, he had a passport and a letter of authority saying that he was allowed to sail through French waters from the French government. But the ship that had been allocated to was the Investigator, and that had been left behind in Sydney as being unseaworthy. And so he was sailing another vessel. And the French governor of Mauritius, General Decazes, said that because it was a different vessel, he said, "You're a spy. This doesn't pertain to you. I'm detaining you as a spy." And Flinders was up in arms about that. He infuriated the general because he refused to doff his cap to the general or salute him. He thought, who's this? They're at war with France, and there was no love lost. And so Flinders refused to be deferential to him, and this infuriated the governor. And he said, well, you can stay in Mauritius until the end of the war if that's your attitude. And unfortunately, it was a very, very long war. And despite lobbying by the British government, because there were prisoner exchange swaps happening all the time, and a lot of the British guys who were imprisoned, it was sort of house arrest in the end in Mauritius. Even though they were imprisoned as well, a lot of them were allowed to leave, and Flinders would be there saying goodbye to them, and he'd have to stay, knowing that he wanted to desperately get back to his wife. His cat was gone. He was very, very lonely and depressed. There was a really, really sad scene in the book at one stage, and in his life, of course, from his diaries, where he sees a ship offshore and he's convinced in his mind, he's been there several years, he's convinced that this is like a commando mission come to get him. And he's there waiting on the beach, and he sees this rowboat coming out with guys on it, and he's running down the beach to get on the boat to sail him out off to French waters. And then as he gets close to the water, he sees that all the guys in the water are African descent, and he realises that they're all French sailors.
No hope.
And he became very, 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 very despondent. But eventually moves were afoot to get him off there, and the French were losing the war, and the governor realised that it would look very, very bad for him at the end of the war if he mistreated this great British explorer for so many years. And so finally he was allowed to leave.
Were his achievements recognised during his own lifetime, do you think, Grantlee?
Not really, because, people like Joseph Banks certainly recognised his achievements, and the Royal Society recognised his achievements. But the Admiralty at the time was far more interested in winning a war with France than they were of discovering what was still pretty much a barren wilderness, even though it had agricultural potential at the end of the earth. They had a very small colony there in Sydney and a little colony eventually on the Derwent at Hobart Town, but it was really still just seen as a dumping ground for convicts. They weren't all that interested, but they were more interested or more worried about the French crossing the English Channel and invading Britain. So the great achievement that Flinders did really pretty much went unrecognised in his time, even when he wrote A Voyage to Terra Australis. It was hardly a bestseller, and it was really only admired and respected in scientific and maritime circles. So he was a great man, pretty much forgotten in his own time, sadly. And by the time he got back to Britain from France, he was pretty much a broken man too. There's a lovely illustration, a painting of him on the front of my book, but even that's a little bit misleading because that was painted while he was in the early days of his capture in Mauritius. By the time he left, he was grey-haired, wearing glasses and pretty much broken and sick. He had a chronic kidney complaint that was probably caused by dehydration, spending so much time on ships and small vessels, navigating without enough fresh water, and he was a dying man.
He writes this book, A Voyage to Terra Australis, and it's really a tragic story. It's published, isn't it? And the day after it's published, he dies. And I understand someone puts it into his hands, but he's unconscious by that stage when it comes out. So it
is a very sad tale. And yet, if you read the book, it's very much the foundations, or pertains so much to the foundations of the country that we live in. And I thought his personality came through, and so much his little funny little jokes and his great humanity. He in dealing with the Indigenous people, he had a very different attitude to many of the British people of his time, and even French. There's a lot of historical revision and they condemn colonialism, but the British, I think, would have been even kinder than perhaps the Portuguese or the Dutch if they had settled Australia. Who knows? But Flinders was certainly cut from a different cloth, and he was very, very respectful in all his dealings with the Indigenous people.
Yes, people sort of describe him as an Enlightenment man in
much,
that respect. Yeah. There's a kind of lovely bookend to this story around his reinterment. So he dies, very sadly, the day after his book's published in 1814, just 40 years old.
Yep.
But I guess as a mariner, perhaps that's not a remarkably short lifespan. Probably, part for the course. But he's buried, and then his grave is sort of lost, isn't it? For is it 100 years or 200 years? Sorry, 200 years it was lost. Yeah.
It's amazing. He was buried in what became, I guess, the surrounds of Euston Station in London, in a church graveyard. And over time, the redevelopment graves were lost, and that happens in a lot of cities. It's happened even in Brisbane. The main huge sports stadium that we have here, Suncorp Stadium, used to be a cemetery, and built over. So those things happen, and Flinders' grave was sadly lost, but the British Rail was tunnelling to make a new fast expressway up to the northern parts of England, Birmingham and Manchester, and in their tunnelling exercises, they knew that there were graves in there, so they sent in teams of archaeologists, not knowing what they'd find, and most of the bodies are gone, and the coffins had it, but they found a breast nameplate with old coffin and some remains in there, and the nameplate said Captain Matthew Flinders, RN. And so the great founder of Australia had been rediscovered. And it's amazing. It's amazing that those archaeologists were using techniques pioneered by Flinders' grandson, Flinders Petrie, who was a great archaeologist in the early years of the early 20th century, and he taught Howard Carter, who discovered Tutankhamun's tomb. So those same archaeological techniques were used to discover Flinders Petrie's grandfather, Matthew Flinders, in his forgotten grave in London. And Flinders was reburied in the church where he was baptised 250 years after his birth, which I thought was extraordinary. And I was very fortunate. One of the great things I love about writing these books, I get to deal with some of the descendants of them. Characters, and Matthew Flinders' descendants are very, 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 very proud of what he did 5 or 6 generations later. Rachel Flinders was very helpful to me in writing the book, and her sisters, and it was wonderful to deal with someone, and they're having one degree of separation with the person who charted and named Australia. I just thought that was wonderful.
Yeah, and actually a very recent and wonderful, as I said, bookend to his story. This was only a few years ago, wasn't it, that he was reinterred?
Yeah, it was only last year. It was extraordinary. The people that organised it in the village of Donington, very community-minded people, they organised, sailors to carry him. It was a full military funeral as befitting a great naval officer. And he was buried in a coffin of the time, and a beautiful marble tombstone put over his, or floor stone put over his grave inside the church. And he's one of the great mariners of all time. It was wonderful to see him get that sort of recognition after so many people had forgotten about him.
Yeah. Well, Grantlee, this has been a wonderful discussion, an important discussion, and I really appreciate what you've done to make the Flinders name once again more meaningful to people than just a name on a station or an island or a street. It's a great book, and I really appreciate your time on Afternoon Light.
Well, that's wonderful. Thank you, Georgina. I really appreciated chatting.
That's it for this week's episode of Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute. Please make sure to subscribe and catch up on our latest online content on our website or on Twitter, LinkedIn or Facebook.